The chandelier above him sparkled as he raised his glass and called me embarrassing in front of my granddaughter. Still, I just dabbed my napkin once, letting the linen absorb what my face wouldn't show. As the crystal lights shimmered across my silverware, they began to sting more than they glowed. While the room laughed with him, I watched the sparkle and remembered every bill I paid to put him here. The same chandelier he toasted under, I bought it, and every inch of the house he thinks he owns. That's when I decided. If I gave him the crown, I could take the castle back in silence. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The banquet hall buzzed with low conversation, punctuated by the occasional clink of wine glasses and the hum of soft jazz from a nearby corner. The crisp, white tablecloths gleamed under the soft, ambient lighting, and the polished silver cutlery caught the glow like tiny, fleeting stars. The kind of place where the air tasted like ambition, and everyone in the room wore a mask of celebration. Eric Langley stood at the front, his navy suit a perfect fit, a sheen of freshly polished confidence on his face. At 43, his new title was the crown he had worked toward for years. The firm had thrown a party in his honor, and everything was just as it should be. He raised his glass, smiled broadly, and the crowd settled into a quiet murmur. To my mentors, the partners who saw potential in me when I was just a hungry kid with a dream, he said, his voice smooth and practiced. And of course, to my incredible wife Maya, who's been by my side every step of the way, no matter what. Maya smiled from the sidelines, her perfect teeth gleaming as she nodded, the edges of her eyes crinkling with the practiced warmth of someone used to performing in public. A round of applause followed, polite and tempered, and Maya leaned in to kiss his cheek. There was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in Eric's posture. He was already moving on, his focus drifting over the crowd, searching for his next target. His gaze found Teresa. She sat at a corner table, the same position she'd always occupied in every milestone of his life, the place where, in his younger years, he had grown used to seeing her, poised, intelligent, always there, always watching. But tonight, it wasn't with pride he looked at her. It wasn't even with affection. It was something else. Eric's lips parted as he raised his glass again, eyes landing on his mother, sitting so quietly that, for a brief moment, he almost forgot she was there. The awkward pause lingered too long, and a small, insincere chuckle escaped his throat. The room followed his lead with laughter, but it was sharp and uncertain. And of course, a special thanks to my mom, Eric continued, his voice ringing out with a polished nonchalance, even if she's always a little embarrassing. The laughter that followed was immediate and, for some, too loud. The kind of forced humor that echoed off the walls and bounced around the room, bouncing off people who weren't quite sure how to respond. Teresa didn't laugh. Her lips remained set, her back straight, her eyes focused on him, unblinking. It wasn't the first time he'd done something like this. Over the years, the little jabs, the casual dismissals had piled up. Embarrassing. It wasn't the word she'd ever want to be associated with. But that word, in his mouth, was almost an afterthought. It was as if he didn't even see her anymore. As if she was a piece of the background to his perfect, polished life. The crowd's laughter gradually died down, but the tension that filled the space was thick. The glasses were still raised. The polite applause still lingered, but there was a ripple, an unsettling shift. Teresa's eyes never left him, and for a long moment, it felt like the entire room had fallen silent, the world pausing for her reaction. But she didn't give it. She simply smiled, tight, controlled. The corners of her mouth twitched, but she didn't blink. Not once. The contrast between the rawness of her quiet dignity and the false sheen of the moment felt almost unbearable. Eric's grin faltered for a fraction of a second, but then it was gone, replaced by a well-practiced smile, one that had learned long ago how to wear the mask of the good son. A loud, intrusive voice broke through the lingering awkwardness. "Teresa, dear, are you all right?" It was Maya, of course. Maya, the social climber, the one who had always known how to pretend, how to smooth things over when the air was thick with discomfort. She stepped forward, her tone too light, her face too composed. Teresa's response was slow, deliberate. "I'm fine, Maya," she said, her voice as composed as her posture. She looked away then, letting her eyes roam the banquet hall, as if nothing about this moment, nothing about Eric's careless words, had any power over her. But as her gaze landed on Harper, she caught the glint of fury in her granddaughter's eyes. Harper, standing near the back of the room, arms crossed tight across her chest, her expression as cold as a winter night. Teresa's chest tightened for a brief moment, but then it was gone, replaced by the quiet understanding that only she and Harper shared. The silence between them spoke more than words ever could. Harper watched her father, the same cold fury settling into her bones. It was a look Teresa had seen in the mirror once, many years ago, when Eric had been a boy. The boy who used to look up to her, who would have never said something so dismissive. Eric laughed again, too loud now, a forced chuckle that didn't reach his eyes. He raised his glass to his mother, a shallow toast. One of those hollow moments that filled the space with noise but nothing real. The crowd mimicked him, a few hesitant clinks. But Teresa was already standing, her movement calm, almost too slow. She turned her back to the room, her heart steady, and for the first time that evening, she exhaled. No one saw it coming. The drive home was a blur, the hum of the tires against the asphalt muffling the noise in her head. Teresa's hands, steady on the wheel, moved through the quiet streets of Cincinnati like a clock ticking away the minutes she had left. Each turn brought her closer to the house, to the place where memories lingered like ghosts, waiting to be remembered or forgotten. She parked in the driveway, the familiar motion automatic, but tonight, nothing felt routine. The air inside the house was stale, thick with the remnants of a life that had once felt full of promise. But now, it was all shifting, like the earth beneath her feet had begun to tremble. Teresa stepped inside. The silence greeted her, a silence that had always been comfortable, but tonight it felt more like a warning. The walls, the furniture, even the pictures on the mantel seemed to watch her as she moved through the hallway, her steps slow, measured. She crossed into the study, where the heavy wooden cabinet loomed against the wall, its beige metal surface unremarkable but carrying the weight of years, of decisions made long before today. Her fingers brushed the cold handle of the cabinet as she opened it. She didn't hesitate. There was no doubt, no uncertainty in her movements. Her hands went straight to the file, the original deed. Teresa Langley and Eric Langley, joint ownership. She pulled it out and placed it on the desk, the paperweight in her hands more significant than the inked words. She ran her fingers over the top of the page for a moment, absorbing the weight of it. A joint ownership. It had been meant to be a partnership, an understanding that had worked for years, or so she had thought. The paper felt like a lie now, a promise that had been broken too many times. She flipped through the folder, pulling out another document. The trust. She scanned it quickly, her eyes catching the familiar name. Eric Langley, primary beneficiary. The title felt like a slap in her face, the very words a reminder of the years she had spent supporting him, only to be dismissed when he no longer needed her. She folded the papers back, the task performed mechanically, her mind already working on what came next. It was almost soothing, the routine of it, the certainty of the next step. She shoved the papers back into the folder and closed it. The quiet of the room pressed in around her. She turned to the laptop, her fingers steady as they slid over the keys. Her mind was already miles ahead, the quiet resolve forming in the pit of her stomach. The clock on the desk ticked softly, but there was nothing soothing about its rhythm. There was only one thing left to do now. The screen flickered to life. She opened the email thread, the one she had started weeks ago with Clara. She needed her advice, her counsel. But this was no longer about advice. This was about finality. The sound of the keyboard clicking filled the room. She began typing, each word deliberate, calculated. The phone rang. Teresa's fingers paused. She didn't need to look at the screen. She knew who it was. Clara. Still want to update that estate plan? Clara's voice came through, smooth and knowing. Teresa leaned back in her chair, her hands still hovering over the keyboard. She stared at the words on the screen, feeling the weight of them. It wasn't a question anymore. It was necessity. The last tether. The final piece to cut free. Not want. Teresa replied softly, her voice steady, unwavering. Need. There was a long pause on the other end. Clara didn't speak right away, but Teresa could feel the understanding pass between them, the unspoken acknowledgement of what this meant, what had to be done. All right, Clara finally said, her voice low but firm. I'll get the papers ready. Teresa didn't need to say anything more. She clicked the send button, the sound of it echoing in the room. The deed, the trust, the will. Everything was about to change. She sat there for a moment, staring at the screen, the future unfolding before her like a road with no clear end, only certainty in the steps she would take. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes. The world, it seemed, was ready for a storm, but inside, there was only calm. Teresa closed her laptop, her fingers pressing the lid shut, as if sealing away the last piece of the past. There would be no turning back now. The late afternoon sun filtered through the half-drawn blinds of Clara's home office, casting long, slanted shadows on the walls. The scent of fresh coffee lingered in the air, a soft, familiar comfort that seemed out of place, given the tension that had filled the last few hours. Teresa stepped inside, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood floor, the sound echoing in the otherwise quiet space. Clara was already at the desk, her hands moving through the paperwork with practiced precision. The older woman didn't need to look up to know who had entered. She knew this moment was coming, and she had already prepared for it. A collection of legal files lay open before her. Deeds, trusts, powers of attorney. Each one a symbol of what had been and what was about to change. Teresa didn't speak as she sat down across from Clara. Her hands, steady as ever, folded neatly in her lap. She didn't have to say much anymore. The decision had already been made. The cold resolve was visible in the sharpness of her posture, in the way her eyes remained focused, unwavering, as if she were steeling herself for what was to come. Clara set a thick file on the desk between them and pushed it toward Teresa. The papers inside were a map of Eric's past, his future, his entire life as it had been designed by his mother's hand. Teresa took the file, her fingers brushing over the edges of the papers inside. She opened it without hesitation, the documents unfolding like a map of the family's history, each one a reminder of the sacrifices she had made. There were the deeds to the house, joint ownership, her name still present next to Eric's. Then there were the financial documents, the powers of attorney that gave him control over her assets, her life. The trust, where he had been the primary beneficiary, the one who would inherit everything, had he only known how to appreciate it. Clara's voice broke through the stillness, soft but certain. He's been primary on everything for years, she said, her eyes never leaving the papers. You set this up, Teresa. Everything is legally bound to him, as it always was. Teresa didn't need to hear this. She had known it all too well. The years of unquestioning loyalty, the years of giving him everything, sacrificing for him, for his success. She had expected gratitude, respect. Instead, she had been treated like a backdrop to his life. His success had come at her expense, her generosity now nothing more than a tool for his ambition. "He doesn't see me as family," Teresa said, her voice low but unyielding. "I won't leave him what family gets." Clara nodded, slowly, as though she had expected this decision all along. The older woman reached for a blank sheet of paper, pulling a pen from her desk drawer. She flipped to a fresh page, the click of the pen breaking the silence. She began drafting a new deed change form, her handwriting neat and methodical. The words that would undo everything, that would shift the balance of control, were already taking shape on the page. Teresa watched, her gaze fixed on the pen as it moved across the paper. Each stroke felt like a stroke of fate, irrevocable and final. She could feel the weight of it, the finality of it. There would be no going back. "Quiet," Teresa said after a moment, her voice steady. "Legal. No drama." Clara didn't respond to the command immediately. She didn't need to. They both understood the gravity of what was being done. No fanfare, no confrontation, no scene. It was a quiet act of retribution, but one that would resound in the coming days. The papers would do the talking. Clara worked silently for a few moments more, drafting the new form, changing the course of history in ways that were invisible to the naked eye. The trust, the deed, the power of attorney, all of it would be rewritten. And Eric, the one who had thought his success was his alone, would find himself outside of the world he had built. Finally, Clara set down the pen, the task done. She slid the page toward Teresa, who took it in her hands, feeling the cool texture of the paper beneath her fingertips. "This will do," Teresa murmured, her voice softer now. But the look in her eyes was anything but soft. It was the look of someone who had finally made the hard decision, someone who had taken control, someone who had stopped being the giver and had started being the one who decided the terms. She looked up at Clara, her expression unreadable. And then, without a word, stood up from her chair. She left the office in silence, the door clicking softly behind her. Outside, the evening sky had turned a deep shade of purple, the first stars beginning to twinkle in the expanse above. The world felt expansive in that moment, full of possibility, full of change. The air was cool, and the breeze carried the scent of the trees in the distance. Teresa walked toward her car, her steps measured, deliberate. Her fingers tightened around the papers in her hands. It was done. The deed was in motion, and there was no turning back. The sound of a car door closing echoed in the stillness of the driveway, but Teresa didn't look up. She was standing at the front door, the cold of the morning air rushing in as she gazed out over the lawn. There was something serene about it, almost empty. But not quite. The house, her house, stood still behind her, a monument to years of sacrifice, love, and disappointment. The grass, freshly mown, stretched out in even lines that seemed to go on forever. The trees along the edge of the yard swayed lightly in the wind, their branches whispering to each other. Inside, the quiet hum of a printer filled the air. Harper was standing at the kitchen table, her shoulders tense as she fed the next page into the scanner, her gaze flicking to her grandmother's still figure at the door. "Are you sure about this?" Harper asked, her voice quiet, but layered with an intensity that spoke of shared anger. "You're erasing him?" Teresa didn't turn around. The question hung in the air like a weight, pulling on her chest. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the doorframe, steadying herself. She had been asked this question before, and she had answered it. But now, with the weight of the papers in front of her, the full weight of the decision pressing down, the words felt different. "No," Teresa said softly, her voice deliberate but low, the hint of a breath barely escaping her. "Just giving him what he gave me. Distance." She let the words linger in the room, the finality of them settling between them. The air felt colder now, like it had shifted somehow, as if the room itself had become aware of what was happening. Harper didn't argue. She didn't need to. She was watching her grandmother carefully, taking in every shift in her posture, every movement, and for a brief moment, the distance between them felt less than it had in the years since Eric had been the center of their family. Harper understood. She always had. Teresa let out a long breath, her hands resting briefly on the cool glass of the window as she watched the wind play with the leaves outside. She wasn't surprised by her own resolve, but there was a part of her that still hesitated, the same part that had always believed in family, in connections. But those had all been stripped away, hadn't they? Her mind returned to the documents, to the quiet signing of the new deed. She had received a call from Clara that morning, clipped and precise. "The quitclaim deed is filed," Clara had said. "Eric's name is gone, it's done." And then, just like that, the last tether between them was cut. Teresa closed her eyes for a moment, letting herself feel the absence of Eric's name. The quietness of it felt like a relief. But it was also a quiet kind of loss. Not in the way she had lost him, because that had been years ago, slowly, piece by piece. But the absence of his name from that deed was the final punctuation mark. It meant nothing could be undone. The sound of the scanner beeped again, pulling her from her thoughts. Harper had finished scanning the documents and was carefully stacking them, her hands steady, though her expression was one of quiet determination. "Everything's ready," Harper said quietly, glancing up from the stack of papers. She met Teresa's gaze, holding it for a moment, and then added, "It's official now. You've revoked his access to everything." Teresa nodded, her chest tight, but her heart steady. The power of attorney, the final legal string between her and her son, had been revoked. The will had been rewritten. Her assets, her decisions, her life, now solely hers. She reached over and touched the papers Harper had neatly arranged. Her fingers traced the top page as if it were a delicate thing. A small sigh escaped her as she picked up the pen that had been placed in front of her. The weight of it was heavier than it had been when she had signed those same papers years ago, when she had thought they would last forever. Harper stepped back slightly, giving her space. Teresa slowly lifted the pen. Her fingers trembled for the briefest of moments, but it was not from doubt. It was from the sheer weight of what she was doing. She wasn't just signing away legal ownership, she was signing away any chance of reconciliation, any chance of them ever being what they once were. The ink flowed onto the paper, smooth and sure. The letters, her name, her signature, each one carrying years of grief, anger, and now, the sense of finality that had always been just out of reach. She signed the last document, the final stroke, and placed the pen down, exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Done," she whispered, though her voice barely carried above the soft murmur of the wind outside. It was both a statement and a question. Done for good. Harper didn't speak for a moment, but she reached out and gently touched her grandmother's arm. There was no need for more words. They both knew what this meant, what had been set into motion. Teresa stood up and looked at the papers one last time. There would be no going back now. Eric was no longer part of the equation. He had been erased, his name gone from the title of the house, from the trust, from everything he thought he had a right to. The silence between them was almost palpable now. But there was something else, too. Something heavier. Something deeper. Harper, standing beside her, finally spoke. "Are you going to tell him?" Teresa didn't look at her granddaughter. She simply stared at the papers on the table in front of her, the finality of them resting in the air like a thick fog. "No," she said after a long pause. "He'll find out. On his own." Her voice was steady, but beneath the calm there was a fire, a quiet, determined fire that had burned away all that was left of the mother he once knew. And when he found out, it wouldn't be with fanfare. It would be in the silence of the law, in the absence of his name where it had once been. And that, she knew, would be enough. The afternoon sun gleamed off the polished windows of the house, casting long shadows over the manicured lawn. Eric stood outside, hands clasped behind his back, proudly surveying his domain. He had invited a group of colleagues from the firm to see the house that was his pride and joy, as he liked to say. The pride in his voice was almost tangible as he spoke, his smile wide, his posture impeccable. He gestured to the house with grand flourishes, the glass of wine in his hand sparkling in the sun. "Here it is, folks," Eric said, his voice carrying over the low hum of conversation. "Our dream home, a product of years of hard work. We couldn't have done it without, well, you know, hard work, determination, and a lot of sacrifice." The guests nodded along, some raising their glasses in agreement, others giving polite chuckles. They were all there to witness his success, to see the fruits of his labor laid out before them like a trophy. Maya stood at his side, smiling with that practiced warmth, her hand gently resting on his arm as she leaned in to listen, occasionally chiming in with her own praises of their beautiful life together. Teresa, sitting inside the house, could hear the echo of their voices drifting in from the yard. But she didn't move. She didn't need to. She had already seen enough of this act, the show of wealth, of success. The life that had once seemed so promising had morphed into something she barely recognized. Her eyes glanced down at the stack of mail on the counter. She had been sorting through it while the tour continued outside. Bills, advertisements, and then a familiar envelope. The one with her name, printed in neat black ink. Teresa Langley, primary owner. Her stomach tightened. The deed to the house, the one she had once shared with Eric, had arrived back in her hands. Clara had dropped it off just that morning, along with the confirmation of what Teresa had already known. The quitclaim deed had been recorded. Eric's name was gone. The mail sat there, silent, like a reminder of what had been, what still was, and what was no longer. She picked it up and moved toward the kitchen window. Eric and his guests were still out there, walking through the garden now, admiring the flowers, the fountain. He pointed to the backyard with an exaggerated sweep of his arm. His back was turned to her, and she took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her. Harper came into the room quietly, stopping next to Teresa and glancing at the stack of mail. "Are we going to tell him today?" Harper asked, her voice soft but knowing. She had seen the house stripped of its warmth years ago, watched as Eric's neglect had pushed them both to this point. Harper didn't need to be told what was in the mail. She could feel the shift in the house, the absence of Eric's name, the silence it carried. "No," Teresa replied with quiet finality. She didn't need to explain. Harper already understood. Let him find out on his own. Teresa walked toward the hallway, her fingers still tightly gripping the deed. The cool edges of the paper felt like an anchor, grounding her in the present while the past, those endless years of sacrifices, of unspoken resentment, pushed against her chest. She had given him everything. He had taken it all for granted. Now it was time to let him see what was left. With a steady hand, Teresa picked up the phone and dialed Simon's number, her voice calm when he answered. "Simon, it's Teresa Langley. I'm at the bank. I need you to check the loan records for me." "Of course, Miss Langley." Simon's voice was as polished as ever. What can I do for you? I just need confirmation that the loan is current, but with one change. The title on the property, it's now just in my name. You've recorded that, correct? There was a long pause. Teresa could almost hear Simon processing the request on the other end. Let me double check. Yes, ma'am. Simon finally replied, his voice turning crisp. The title has been updated. Everything is in order. The loan is still current, but now it is titled solely to you. No one else is on the deed, just as you requested. Teresa's grip tightened on the phone, but her voice didn't falter. Thank you, Simon. She hung up, the silence of the room filling her ears. That was it. The last of Eric's claim was gone. He was no longer tied to the house, the property, or anything that came with it. The family had been cut out of the equation, the narrative had shifted, and it was now official. Teresa turned back to the window, her gaze settling on Eric and his guests, still laughing, still unaware. Her fingers brushed the edge of the stack of papers. The feeling was almost surreal. For all his bluster about hard work, about building things from the ground up, he had never understood that nothing is truly built without a foundation of respect. Harper, standing beside her now, glanced out the window too, watching Eric show off his success with the casual arrogance that had marked his rise. Is he really going to keep pretending? Harper muttered under her breath, the words barely audible. Teresa didn't reply. Instead, she turned back to the stack of papers and slowly picked up the deed, the one that had been filed just hours ago, and placed it carefully on the counter. The absence of Eric's name felt like a breath she had been holding for far too long. Out in the yard, Eric raised his glass, a broad grin on his face as he looked over his guests. We couldn't have done it without hard work, folks. No shortcuts, no handouts. This is all ours. Every inch. Teresa turned away from the window, her heart steady, her thoughts clear. No, she whispered to herself, just loud enough for Harper to hear. It's not his. Not anymore. The sound of laughter continued outside, a hollow echo against the walls of the house. Eric would never understand what he had lost, but Teresa did, and that was enough. The doors to the bank opened with a sharp whoosh, the cool air of the outside world crashing into the warm, fluorescent-lit interior. Eric Langley's suit was crisp, his tie tightly knotted, but the anger in his eyes twisted the normally composed figure into something unrecognizable. He stormed past the tellers, ignoring the polite but confused glances from customers. His focus was singular, his footsteps hard and fast against the polished marble floor. Simon Drake looked up from his desk as Eric approached, his face immediately shifting from the casual smile of a bank employee to the cautious neutrality of someone who recognized a brewing storm. Eric didn't wait for any pleasantries. He slammed the deed down on Simon's desk, the sound of the paper hitting the wood sharp in the otherwise quiet space. What the hell is this? Eric's voice was low, but the tension in it vibrated through the air like a wire about to snap. Simon blinked, trying to hide the shock that flickered across his face. He glanced at the document, his eyes widening just slightly before he regained control. Mr. Langley, this is the quitclaim deed for the Langley property. As per your mother's instructions, the title was changed. Eric's lips curled into a sneer. Changed? This is my house, he growled, his voice rising. It was jointly owned. My name is on the deed. What the hell did she do? Simon calmly adjusted his glasses, his voice steady despite the anger in front of him. The ownership was legally adjusted, Mr. Langley. The title is now solely in your mother's name. There's nothing I can do. The documents have been recorded. Eric's face reddened, his fingers curling into fists. He slammed both hands down on the desk. You're telling me she just took me off the deed? His voice was rising now, drawing the attention of a few of the other bank employees. This is insane. Simon exhaled slowly, keeping his tone neutral. It's all in order, Mr. Langley. There's no legal recourse. The documents are finalized. Eric leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing. I don't care what your damn documents say. I've worked for everything in that house. My name belongs on that deed. His voice was strained, desperate. She's senile, Simon. She doesn't know what she's doing. This isn't her decision. Simon hesitated. He could see the frustration, the panic rising in Eric's eyes, but there was nothing more to be said. I'm afraid there's nothing we can do. The transaction is complete. Eric slammed his fist against the desk one more time before he turned sharply and stormed out of the bank, the doors swinging behind him with a force that echoed in the empty space. As Eric's figure disappeared out the door, Simon leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He had done everything by the book, and now the storm was on the horizon. He knew it wouldn't be long before Eric came back. This wasn't over. But for now, Simon could only watch as the tension built in the air like a thunderstorm waiting to break. Later that afternoon, Teresa sat at the kitchen table, sipping her tea. The phone rang, the sudden sound jolting her from her thoughts. She glanced at the caller ID. It was Maya. Teresa hesitated, then answered the call. Maya. There was no pleasantry in Maya's voice when she spoke. What the hell is going on, Teresa? The words were sharp, cutting through the air like daggers. What did you do? Eric just stormed into the bank demanding answers. What kind of insane move was this? Teresa's lips curled into a small, bitter smile, though her voice remained calm. I did what I had to do. Maya's voice rose. You can't just take his name off the deed like that. You've robbed him of everything. You know what he's done for this family, for you. You're not thinking clearly. Teresa's breath caught in her throat, a fleeting flicker of emotion rising, but she squashed it down quickly. She wasn't about to apologize. Not now. I don't need your approval, Maya, Teresa said, her voice smooth and cold. But I do need you to understand. This is not about Eric anymore. This is about me. About what I've earned. What's mine? Maya's laughter, sharp and brittle, sounded on the other end of the line. Earned? You really think you're in the right here? You've ruined his life. If you think Eric's going to just accept this quietly, you're mistaken. Teresa's grip tightened on her teacup, but her voice remained unwavering. I agreed, Maya. I agreed with what had to be done, and now he'll have to live with the consequences. Before Maya could respond, Teresa ended the call, the silence in the room louder than the conversation had been. She leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting to the window where the sun had begun to dip below the horizon, the sky turning dark with the approach of evening. The deed had been done. Eric's name was gone from the property, gone from her life. The phone buzzed again almost immediately. She knew what it was before she even checked. Clara's number. She didn't hesitate to answer. Everything going as planned? Clara's voice was businesslike but laced with a certain warmth, a hint of understanding that only the two of them shared. Teresa exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing for the first time that day. Yes, she said, her voice steady. It's done. He's out of the house. It's just mine now. Clara's response was quiet but satisfied. Good. You've made the right choice. Eric won't understand it now, but he'll have to. Let him scream. Let him run around, but we both know this was the only way. Teresa glanced out the window once more, watching the shadows stretch longer across the yard. She knew the storm wasn't over. Not yet. But it was coming. And she would be ready. The sun had dipped behind the clouds, and the house was bathed in a quiet twilight glow. Teresa sat at her desk, the weight of the day still pressing on her shoulders, but there was something serene about this moment. Something final. Her fingers danced across the keyboard, the soft clicking of the keys steady in the silence. The new trust was almost complete. She had made sure of every word, every clause, that it would stand up to any challenge. It would be airtight. Eric's name was nowhere in sight. no longer the primary beneficiary, no longer tied to anything that she had worked for. The house was gone. The title had been altered. Now, the trust was the last link, the last piece to sever. Clara had emailed her the final draft that morning. Teresa had looked over it carefully, pausing on the line where Eric's name had once been. It was now replaced with Harper's. Her granddaughter. The one who had never dismissed her, never taken her sacrifices for granted. The one who still understood the value of quiet love. Her fingers hovered over the final details. The clause that would make Harper the sole beneficiary was clear, but there was one more thing to add. A clause that would ensure Harper earned her inheritance. Teresa's lips curved into a faint smile as she typed the words. Harper Langley, sole beneficiary, with the condition that she must complete a college or trade school education before inheriting the full sum. Teresa sat back in her chair, staring at the screen. It was perfect. It wasn't about punishment. It was about ensuring that the inheritance was earned, not through noise or manipulation, but through effort. It was a lesson in responsibility, one that Eric would never understand. She leaned forward, pressing send on the email to Clara. The final version was now in their hands. There would be no more second-guessing, no more doubts. Her fingers moved to the thick pile of papers on the desk, carefully organized, each document representing a decision that could never be undone. The revised trust, the quitclaim deed, the new will. They were all here. She picked up the trust, the final version, the one that would set everything into motion. Teresa reached for the pen, her hand steady as she signed the document with precision, each stroke deliberate. The weight of the pen felt heavier than it had before. It wasn't the weight of the ink on the page. It was the weight of what she was truly doing. She wasn't just securing her future. She was ensuring that Eric and Maya would never again take what wasn't theirs. She was ensuring that Harper, her granddaughter, would inherit what had always been meant for her, what she had worked hard to earn. Teresa placed the pen down with a soft click, then reached for the next document. The will. It was almost identical to the previous one, but now, there was a clear, final distinction. Harper was the sole beneficiary, and no one else. She signed it as well, a quiet resolution settling in her chest. Outside, the wind had picked up, the trees swaying gently in the twilight. The soft whistle of the wind was the only sound that reached her ears. It was peaceful, the calm before the storm. She gathered the papers together and slid them into the fireproof safe under the desk. It was a small, nondescript thing, tucked against the wall, but it was the final keeper of her decisions. The final place where everything she had worked for would stay safe. With one last glance at the documents, Teresa closed the safe, securing it with the familiar click of the lock. It was done. There would be no turning back now. She stood up slowly, her back straight, her mind already thinking of the next steps. She would have to make sure that Eric and Maya knew soon enough that they couldn't do anything about it. The quiet revenge that had been in motion for weeks was now final. Their names had been erased from her life, from her family's legacy. Teresa turned and looked out the window. The house, Eric's house, was now empty. He could live in it, but he would never truly own it again. It was just a building, and it meant nothing without the foundation of respect that had long been lost. Her thoughts wandered back to Harper. She had always been the quiet one, the one who didn't demand attention, the one who listened. She earns it by listening, Teresa muttered under her breath. She could almost hear Clara's response in her head, the older woman's voice calm but knowing. Quiet revenge is still legal. And that was the key, wasn't it? The quiet part. The part that nobody saw coming. Eric could scream all he wanted, could try to twist the narrative any way he wanted. But in the end, it was the silence that spoke loudest. Teresa stood there for a long moment, letting the stillness of the house settle around her. The fireproof safe was locked. The papers were in their place. Everything was prepared for the moment when Eric would find out what had truly been taken from him, and when that moment came, she would be ready. Teresa reached for her coat, moving with deliberate purpose toward the door. There was one more thing she had to do. Eric was about to learn a very painful lesson. The first rays of dawn filtered softly through the trees, casting long, cool shadows across the garden path. The air was crisp, and the quiet of the morning was soothing in a way that seemed to cleanse the house of its recent tension. Teresa walked slowly, her feet barely disturbing the dew-laden grass, each step deliberate as she moved along the familiar route. The path she had walked 1,000 times before was now a place of clarity, a reminder of everything she had built and everything she had taken back. The roses she had planted years ago were in full bloom, their deep reds and soft pinks vibrant against the pale light of morning. The air smelled fresh, the scent of earth and flowers grounding her. She had cultivated this garden with her own hands, and now, it was hers to enjoy in silence. It was a quiet victory, the kind that didn't need to be announced or paraded. It simply was. Teresa's fingers brushed against the petals of a rose as she continued her walk, the peace of the moment settling around her like a comforting blanket. The weight of everything, the house, the decisions, the separation felt lighter this morning, as if the world outside had softened with the first light of day. She stopped by the old oak tree, resting a hand on its trunk. The oak had stood here for years, its branches twisting upward, each one a symbol of the resilience she had inherited and nurtured. A bird flew overhead, its wings cutting through the cool morning air. Teresa watched it disappear into the horizon, and for a moment, she felt as though she, too, could fly, free from the burdens that had tied her down for so long. A soft, familiar voice broke through the stillness. "Grandma." Teresa turned, her gaze meeting Harper's as her granddaughter stepped onto the garden path, a steaming mug of tea in her hands. Harper's face was serene, her expression soft yet serious, the way it always was when she had something on her mind. "Good morning," Teresa said, her voice low but warm. Harper walked toward her, handing her the mug with a small smile. She sat beside her on the stone bench, the steam rising from her tea mingling with the morning air. For a moment, they sat in silence, each of them letting the peacefulness of the garden wash over them. Finally, Harper spoke, her voice quiet but laced with an underlying tension. "He's still texting me." Teresa exhaled softly, not surprised by the news. Eric had never been good at accepting boundaries, and now, with everything in motion, it seemed he was grasping for any way to reassert control. He was probably sending messages full of anger, confusion, and maybe even guilt. Anything to try to reel Harper back in. Anything to hold on to whatever he thought he still had. "Block him," Teresa said, her tone gentle but firm. "You're not a messenger." Harper hesitated, her eyes flickering briefly to the phone she had placed on the stone table in front of them. "But what if he's—" "He's not your responsibility," Teresa cut in, her voice unwavering. "You don't need to carry his burden. You've got your own path to walk now. Your own future to focus on." Harper looked at her grandmother, a faint frown crossing her face, but she nodded slowly. She understood. She had always understood. The quiet strength of Teresa had always been a guiding light for her, even in the darkest times. But this was different. This was final. And it was for Harper to shape her own life now, not to pick up the pieces of a broken relationship that Eric had long since abandoned. Teresa took a sip of her tea, the warmth spreading through her as she turned her gaze back to the garden. The world outside had moved on, and so had she. But the silence that followed was soon broken again, this time by a card. A thick, white envelope slipped through the mail slot, landing with a soft thud on the doorstep. Teresa's eyes flickered toward the front door, knowing exactly what it was before she even saw the familiar handwriting. Maya. Harper stood up, walking toward the door with a quiet curiosity. Should I open it? No, Teresa said immediately, her voice sharp but calm. Leave it. Harper paused, her hand hovering over the envelope, but she didn't open it. She knew better than to push. Instead, she walked back to the bench, sitting down next to her grandmother again. Teresa stood up, leaving the tea on the table as she made her way to the door. With one firm motion, she picked up the envelope and threw it directly into the trash can without a second thought. Maya's attempt to reassert herself, her veiled insults hidden behind the facade of concern, meant nothing. Not anymore. The card would never be read. Not today. Not ever. She returned to Harper's side, feeling the stillness of the morning surround them once more. Harper looked up at her, her expression unreadable, but there was something in her eyes, a quiet gratitude. Teresa sat down beside her once again, the weight of the past few weeks finally feeling like it had been lifted. The world, it seemed, had already begun to shift around them. The storm Eric had set in motion would come, of course, but it would come in his own time. And Teresa would be ready. "Grandma," Harper said after a long pause, her voice soft but resolute. "You're going to be okay, aren't you?" Teresa looked out across the garden, her thoughts drifting to the life she had rebuilt for herself, and the one she had built for Harper. "I've always been okay," she said, her voice steady and sure. "And now, we'll both be fine." The wind stirred the leaves in the trees, and for the first time in years, the world felt quiet, still, untouched by the past. And it was exactly the way she wanted it. The courtroom was cold, the kind of sterile chill that seemed to settle in the bones, making even the most seasoned attorneys uncomfortable. Teresa sat at the back, her fingers lightly resting on the cold wood of the bench, her back straight, her expression unreadable. She hadn't bothered to dress up for the occasion. There was no need. Today wasn't about appearances or trying to prove anything. It was just the final act in a drama Eric had unwittingly set into motion. Eric was at the front, of course, pacing back and forth with his lawyer, the very picture of aggression and indignation. His jaw was clenched, his eyes hard. His suit was freshly pressed, but it didn't hide the desperation in his movements. Maya sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze darting from one person to the next, her eyes betraying a flicker of doubt. Clara sat beside Teresa, her face calm and confident, a stark contrast to the chaos swirling at the other side of the courtroom. The air was thick with tension, the battle lines drawn clearly between Teresa and her son, though Eric was too blinded by his pride to see how far he had already lost. The judge, an older man with thin gray hair and a permanent crease between his eyebrows, looked down at the papers in front of him, adjusting his glasses. He had been reviewing the case for a while now, and the more he read, the more incredulous his expression became. Eric's lawyer had been trying to make a case for contesting the power of attorney and the new will that had been updated with Harper as the sole beneficiary. They had hoped to argue that Teresa had been incapacitated or influenced unduly in her decision-making, that she didn't have the mental capacity to remove Eric from her affairs. But Clara had anticipated this. She had come prepared. She slid a thick manila folder across the table to the judge, who glanced at it and immediately flipped it open. He paused, then flipped through the pages with increasing speed. Each piece of paper was a quiet blow to Eric's already fragile case. There were copies of emails between Teresa and Clara, clearly detailing Teresa's mental state and her intent to change her will. There were notarized statements from healthcare professionals confirming Teresa's mental clarity, and then a digital paper trail. Evidence of transactions, phone calls, and texts, all showing Teresa's consistent decision-making and control over her assets, up to the final signing of the documents. Clara leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing slightly as she watched the judge read. She knew this was a formality now. The truth was laid out clearly, and there was no arguing it. Eric's lawyer, clearly feeling the weight of the evidence, tried to push one last plea. But, Your Honor, we must consider that Mrs. Langley, in her emotional state, might not have fully understood the ramifications of her decisions. This is not a decision made in clear thinking, but in a moment of... Enough! The judge interrupted, his voice firm as he looked up from the papers. The evidence is clear. Mrs. Langley made her decisions with full mental capacity. The documents are valid. Your claim is dismissed. The silence in the room was palpable, broken only by the rustling of papers and the soft shuffle of chairs. Eric's face turned a shade of crimson that even his designer suit couldn't conceal. He looked from his attorney to the judge, and then back to Teresa, his eyes burning with a mix of anger and disbelief. He stood up abruptly, slamming his hands against the table. This is bullshit. You can't just take everything from me. I earned this. His voice cracked, the last remnants of his control slipping away. Teresa didn't flinch. She didn't move. She simply sat there, her gaze steady, unwavering, like the calm after a storm. Harper, sitting beside her, looked over at her grandmother, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. Eric's outburst continued, his words a blur, but they had no real weight anymore. He was shouting into the void, desperate to hold on to something that had already slipped through his fingers. Finally, the judge called for order, his gavel coming down with a loud bang that silenced the room. The matter is closed. The will stands. Mrs. Langley retains full control over her assets. This case is dismissed. Teresa stood as the judge left the room, his decision final. The room seemed to exhale as Eric slumped back into his seat, defeated. He looked like a man who had just realized that no matter how loudly he screamed, the world wouldn't bend to his will. Maya, her face a mask of frustration, reached out to him, but he recoiled, his anger still boiling beneath the surface. Teresa turned to Clara, a small smile crossing her lips. That was almost too easy. Clara chuckled softly, her eyes glinting with satisfaction. Quiet revenge is still legal. Teresa didn't respond. She simply walked out of the courtroom, her footsteps firm and measured. She had done what needed to be done. Eric would have to live with the consequences of his own actions. Harper was waiting for her in the hallway, her expression soft, but knowing. He's embarrassed now. Teresa nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving the door through which Eric had just stormed out. He started it, she said quietly, her voice low but firm. And just like that, everything was exactly as it should be. Teresa Langley had taken back control, and Eric's world would never be the same. The morning light was sharp and bright as it filtered through the blinds of the living room, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors. Teresa stood at the front door, her fingers brushing the keypad as she reset the alarm system. The quiet beeping of the sequence a constant reminder that everything was now different. She had done it with purpose, each button pressed deliberate and calculated, the combination of numbers now belonging solely to her. The house, her home, was hers again. Truly, completely hers. The key that had always been in the small ceramic dish by the door, a relic of family comfort, was gone. No spare key left for Eric. No reminder of the years when he had been a part of this life, when this house had been a shared home. Her fingers hovered over the keypad once more as she programmed the final changes, sealing the door with a finality that felt almost freeing. The locks were reset. The security system fortified. It was done. She could feel the weight of it. The sense of reclaiming control. Of taking back what had been hers all along. slowly settling into her bones. It wasn't just about the house, the deed, or the trust. It was about her life, her decisions, her right to move forward without the weight of someone else's entitlement pressing down on her. The sound of footsteps echoed from behind her. She didn't turn as Harper appeared in the hallway, her expression thoughtful as she moved toward the front door, her eyes scanning the security system with a quiet curiosity. "You're really going all in, aren't you?" Harper asked softly, leaning against the door frame. Teresa didn't answer immediately. She stood still for a moment, letting the finality of her actions settle in, as the silence stretched between them. Harper's voice broke the stillness again. "Are you ever going to let him back in?" Teresa's fingers moved over the keypad, rechecking her work. "No," she said, the words simple but firm. "Not unless he learns what respect is." Harper gave a small nod, her eyes drifting to the front door. She glanced at her grandmother, then back at the locked door, her expression shifting slightly. "You ever think about selling it?" Teresa turned to face her granddaughter, her gaze steady and unwavering. There was a moment of silence as the weight of the question hung in the air. Selling. The thought had crossed her mind, often, in fact, but not yet. Not today. "Not yet," Teresa said quietly. "But maybe soon. We'll see. For now, it's enough to have it be just ours." Harper smiled faintly, sensing the depth in her grandmother's words. "I think he's going to lose it when he finds out," she said softly, a quiet satisfaction in her voice. Teresa didn't respond immediately. She had already heard the way Eric's voice had cracked in the courtroom, how he had stormed out, the fury and disbelief still hanging in the air. She could imagine his next move, trying to break into the house, demanding his share. It was only a matter of time. Her fingers brushed over the keypad again, resetting the alarm to its final setting. No more access. No more control. The front doorbell rang sharply, cutting through the quiet. Teresa froze, her heart rate quickening for a brief moment. She had expected this, but the sound still caught her off guard. Harper stood up, turning toward the door. "Are you expecting anyone?" Teresa shook her head. She knew exactly who it was. She had taken precautions, but Eric was relentless, and now that the court had ruled against him, the only thing left for him to do was lash out. Harper moved toward the door, but Teresa held up a hand, her expression calm and composed. "Leave it." Harper stopped in her tracks, a glance of understanding passing between them. It wasn't the doorbell they needed to worry about. It was what would come next. Teresa stepped forward, walking slowly to the window, her eyes narrowing as she looked out. There, in the driveway, was Eric, standing beside Maya. Eric was holding a piece of paper in his hand, probably another attempt to manipulate, to demand something that wasn't his. His body language was that of a man who had just realized he had no power left. Teresa felt the calm wash over her once more, a quiet satisfaction filling her chest. She had seen this moment coming. She had known Eric would try to break through every barrier she set. But the lock on the door? That wasn't something he could change. Not anymore. Maya's voice floated through the door, sharp and insistent. "Teresa, open the door. You can't keep us out of our own house." Teresa didn't move from the window. Her gaze remained fixed on Eric and Maya. She could feel the anger radiating from them, but she wasn't moved by it. There was nothing they could do. The house was hers. The deed was hers. She heard the sound of Maya banging on the door, the persistent knocking rising in volume, but she didn't flinch. She had already made her decision. Eric had made his mistake. He had assumed he could take everything without understanding the price. "Let them bark." Clara's voice rang through her memory, a wry smile in her voice. The doors reinforced. Teresa stood tall, her gaze never wavering from the scene unfolding outside. She didn't need to respond. She didn't need to explain. She had already won. And when Eric and Maya finally realized it, it would be too late. The air inside the house had changed since the locks had been reset. It wasn't just the absence of Eric's presence, though that was unmistakable. It was quieter, as if the house itself was finally breathing, finally at peace. The rooms, once filled with the noise of pretense, now held only the soft sound of footsteps, of calm decision-making. Teresa walked through the living room, her eyes scanning the space she had once shared with her son and daughter-in-law. The furniture was the same, but the energy had shifted. She had removed herself from the chaos of it all, and now it was hers again. A knock on the door broke the silence. Teresa turned, her movements slow and measured, as though nothing in her world could disturb the calm she had created. She opened the door to find a familiar face, Sam Watkins, the realtor who had sold the house to Eric all those years ago. "Teresa," Sam said, offering a warm smile. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I wanted to talk about listing the house. I heard about the situation and I thought, well, if you're ready to move on." Teresa returned the smile, stepping aside to let him in. "It's time," she said simply. They walked through the house, Sam making notes in his tablet as they moved from room to room. He seemed to sense the finality in the air. There was no rush, no pressure, just the quiet understanding that this was the next step. "You know," Sam said as they reached the kitchen, "this place could fetch a great price. It's got a lot of potential. Market's strong right now. We could list it at full value, no problem." Teresa nodded, her eyes lingering on the countertops where, years ago, she had baked cookies for Eric, had made dinners for Maya. She could still hear the sound of their laughter echoing in these walls, but it had been replaced with something else now. Something quieter. "We'll list it," she said. "Full market value. It's time for it to go." Sam looked at her, a hint of surprise in his eyes. "You're sure?" "I'm sure," she said, her voice steady. "It's time to let go of all of it." Sam nodded, tapping the screen of his tablet as he began to draft the listing. The house would be sold. The last piece of her connection to Eric would be severed, and she would move forward. There would be no looking back. After Sam left, Teresa returned to the living room, where she had begun the task of packing up a few of her favorite things. It wasn't a big task, just a few small mementos, things that held the most meaning. She placed a framed photograph of Harper on the mantel, her fingers lingering on the glass as she thought about what was coming. A few boxes were packed, nothing too extravagant, just the essentials. She didn't need much. What she needed was already with her. Her strength, her resolve, and her future. By mid-afternoon, the house was quiet again. The sale would be posted online soon enough. She could almost hear the whispers from the neighbors already. They would know soon enough that the house was on the market. Word traveled fast in a neighborhood like theirs. Eric, no doubt, would hear about it soon too. He had a way of staying up to date on everything, even when it no longer concerned him. Teresa stood at the window, watching the world outside move forward. She saw a neighbor, Greg, across the street, waving as he jogged by. She waved back, but her thoughts were elsewhere. It wasn't long before she heard the phone ring. "Eric. Are you seriously making a scene, Teresa?" His voice crackled through the line, a mix of disbelief and fury. "You're selling the house? You're just going to erase everything like it never mattered?" Teresa didn't hesitate. She sat down at the kitchen table, her fingers tracing the edge of the wood. She felt the calm rise inside her. "You made it first," she replied, her voice quiet but firm. With a microphone. Eric's response was a mix of frustration and outrage, but Teresa didn't need to listen. His anger was nothing compared to the satisfaction that sat heavy in her chest. She had taken control, and now nothing could stop her. "I didn't erase anything," she continued, her tone softer now, almost peaceful. "I just took back what was always mine." She hung up the phone before he could respond, feeling the finality of it settle into her bones. The house was listed. Eric would know soon enough. And when he did, there would be no going back. Teresa turned back toward the living room, where the empty spaces in the house felt more like opportunities than losses. This was just the beginning. She was free. The sale had gone through quickly, almost too easily, given the emotional weight Teresa had expected. The paperwork was signed without fanfare. The house officially transferred to new owners. It was strange, in a way, watching the world move so effortlessly, as if the past had been so easily erased. But it hadn't been erased. It had been understood, its lessons etched into her soul. Now, standing in the quiet of her new condo, Teresa felt a lightness she hadn't known in years. The space was smaller, more intimate, less of a monument to the past, more of a clean slate for the future. The condo had been paid off entirely, the proceeds from the house sale enough to secure her new life without any lingering debt. No mortgage, no ties. She walked from room to room, taking in the freshly painted walls and the sparse furniture. The view of the city below was far more peaceful than the suburban sprawl she had left behind. There was no grandeur to this place, no looming shadows of a life once shared, just open space, the perfect balance of independence and comfort. Harper had helped her move in. More than once, Teresa had caught the look of admiration in her granddaughter's eyes. Harper had been quieter than usual, helping with boxes and setting up shelves, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. Harper was old enough now to see it, to understand what this move really meant. It wasn't just a physical relocation, it was the end of one chapter and the deliberate beginning of another. As Harper finished unpacking the last of the kitchen boxes, she looked over at her grandmother, her hands on her hips. "So what now?" she asked, her voice light but layered with the question only someone close to Teresa would dare ask. Teresa set the last plate into the cabinet, standing still for a moment before answering. She could feel the weight of her choices settling into her bones, but there was no regret. "Now," she said slowly, turning to face Harper. "We live." Harper smiled, nodding as she put the last box down and walked over to give her grandmother a quick hug. "You've earned this," she said, her voice full of quiet admiration. Teresa squeezed her tight, a warm feeling spreading through her chest. "We both have." Later that evening, Clara arrived with a bottle of wine, the cork already popped as she set it down on the kitchen table. She raised her glass with a knowing smile, the kind that came only after a long battle fought and won. "To clean exits," Clara said, her tone both playful and deep, the weight of the moment lingering in her words. Teresa clinked her glass with Clara's, savoring the simple joy of the gesture. The battle wasn't over. Eric was still out there, still furious, still clinging to the life he thought he had a right to. But in this moment, there was peace. She didn't need to fight anymore. She had already won. Outside, the sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow through the large windows. Teresa turned back to the view, the sound of the city below almost soothing in its distance. For the first time in years, she could hear her own thoughts without the noise of Eric's entitlement crowding them out. But as the evening settled in, something stirred in her, a sound she had half expected but still hadn't fully prepared for. The sound of a car. Tires on the pavement, moving slow. A familiar engine. She didn't need to look to know who it was. Eric. Her pulse quickened for a moment, but she didn't flinch. She wasn't afraid. This was the next stage. As she turned to look out the window, she saw his car, slick, black, unmistakable, drive by. It slowed down in front of the old house, stopping just long enough for him to look at it. She could see him from here, sitting still, his hands gripping the wheel. The world outside seemed to hold its breath. Teresa didn't feel any satisfaction in his obvious frustration. It was something else. A quiet, almost sad understanding. He had driven by to see the house for the last time, to see the home he had once believed was his, now fully out of his reach. He had lost it all, through his own pride, his own greed, and there was nothing left for him to take. She turned away from the window, her gaze returning to Clara and Harper, who were both talking softly, their laughter a low hum in the background. The moment passed quickly, as it always did. When Eric finally drove away, he left no trace, no confrontation, no noise. He had learned the hard way that the fight for ownership was never truly about property or material things. It was about respect. And respect had been taken from him, just as easily as he had taken everything else. Teresa took a deep breath, savoring the silence that now settled around her. For the first time in years, she felt fully in control. Everything she had fought for, every choice she had made, every quiet step she had taken, had led her here. And now, as the door clicked shut behind her, she knew the rest of her life would be hers to live. No one else would write her story for her. The final page was already turned. The soft glow of the desk lamp illuminated Teresa's face as she sat at her new desk in the condo, a sheet of paper in front of her. The world outside was still, the city lights below twinkling like distant stars. In the quiet of her new life, it felt almost surreal. Yet here she was, writing one last letter to Eric. Not to him directly, but to the ones who would care most about his reputation. She picked up the pen, feeling its weight in her hand. It was the same pen she'd used to sign the quitclaim deed, to write her will, to sever the ties that bound her to him. She paused for a moment, the quiet room humming with the energy of what she was about to do. The letter was simple, but it carried the weight of everything she had endured. She didn't need to write anything dramatic. There was no need for an outpouring of emotion. This was about cold facts, the quiet kind of revenge that didn't scream, but still made itself known. She began to write, her handwriting steady, the words forming deliberately on the page. To the managing partners of Langley and Comfer, I am writing to bring to your attention the recent behavior of Eric Langley, my son, whose actions may directly affect the firm's reputation. Over the years, Eric has displayed a pattern of manipulative behavior, using both legal challenges and personal threats in an attempt to gain control over my assets. His disregard for legal and moral boundaries has only grown, culminating in a series of actions that, I believe, may damage the integrity of the firm. I have recently updated my will and trust, removing Eric as the beneficiary of my estate due to these behaviors. This decision was not made lightly, but with the understanding that respect and trust, once lost, cannot be easily regained. I trust you will take this information into account as you move forward with any professional dealings involving Eric. I have attached supporting documentation, including legal filings and statements that detail his attempts to manipulate the situation for personal gain. Sincerely, Teresa Langley. She paused after writing the final sentence, her fingers lingering on the paper. It wasn't much. It didn't need to be. It was clear. It was precise. And it would have the desired effect. No threats, no empty promises, just the truth. Eric's manipulation, his arrogance, his disregard for boundaries, all laid out in the most objective way possible. Teresa folded the letter carefully, placing it in an envelope. She didn't need to add her return address. That would only lead back to her. No, this letter had to be anonymous, the kind of quiet blow that would not be traced back to her. She had already made the decision to live in peace. But peace did not mean letting Eric's actions go unchecked. He needed to understand that no matter how loud he shouted, no matter how hard he tried to manipulate the narrative, there were still consequences. The phone rang, breaking her concentration. Teresa glanced at the screen. It was Maya. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned back to the envelope, slipping it into a larger envelope addressed to the managing partners of the firm. Then, with a steady hand, she sealed it. A knock on the door interrupted her final preparations. It was Clara, her face calm but with an edge of curiosity. "Are you sure about this?" Clara asked as she entered the condo, taking in the empty boxes stacked in the corner, the clean lines of the new space. Teresa stood up, walking over to the desk where the letter lay. "It's done," she said quietly. "I'm just ensuring that there's no misunderstanding. His actions need to have consequences." Clara nodded, her eyes narrowing slightly as she reviewed the letter. "It's concise, it's clean, it'll make an impact, even if it's not immediate. He won't see it coming." Teresa smiled faintly. "Good." Clara took the letter and held it out for notarization. She glanced up at Teresa, her expression one of quiet approval. "You've done what needed to be done. It'll hit him quietly, just the way you like it." Teresa picked up the letter, her fingers brushing over the edge of the envelope. She thought for a moment about the silence that would follow. No one needed to know that it was her. It was enough for her to know that Eric's reputation was about to take a hit. Slowly, quietly, without fanfare. Teresa handed the envelope to Clara, who carefully stamped it with her seal, confirming the notarization. Without another word, Clara took it, ready to mail it out. The letter would be sent, postmarked from Teresa's condo, not revealing anything about her involvement. It would be a quiet statement that would still send a loud message. Later that evening, Eric's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his hands shaking slightly as he read the email notification from the firm. It was clear, it was brief, and it stung with the quietest of power. A reminder that his manipulations had not gone unnoticed. Not everything could be bought or manipulated. His reputation would be forever tarnished by the silent, undeniable truth of his actions. Meanwhile, Teresa stood by the window, watching as the city lights flickered below her. Her phone buzzed again, but this time it was Maya calling. She ignored it, as she always did now. There was nothing left to say to Maya. She had already spoken her truth. Eric's name would be dragged through the mud, but in the quietest way possible. He would never know who had delivered the blow, just that it had been done. And it would hurt more than anything loud, because silence, after all, speaks the loudest. The sun had barely crept over the horizon when Teresa stepped out onto the small patio of her new condo, the morning air crisp and cool against her skin. The city, still sleepy in the early hours, seemed distant and muffled, a world away from the one she had left behind. There were no cars racing by, no hurried footsteps, just the quiet hum of a life now hers to shape. She knelt down, the worn gloves on her hands grounding her in the simple, steady rhythm of planting. The rosemary was small but fragrant, the sprigs a bright contrast against the grayish soil. She buried the roots gently, the leaves catching the light, casting long shadows across the small garden box. It was a simple ritual, one of care, of renewal. The rosemary was for remembrance, of herself, of her strength, of how far she had come. And as she pressed the earth back into place, her fingers touching the tiny leaves, Teresa felt the weight of her choices settle into her chest with a quiet satisfaction. This was her peace. She stood, brushing off her knees, and surveyed the small garden patch that would soon be filled with more herbs, more plants, each one chosen deliberately, each one marking the start of something new. It wasn't a grand garden, not the sprawling kind she'd once dreamed of when the house had been shared with Eric. No, this was hers alone, the garden a reflection of her present. Simple, grounded in what she could tend to, in what she had control over. Teresa turned back into the condo, the door creaking slightly as she stepped back into the quiet warmth of the living room. The faint smell of rosemary lingered on her hands, and she ran them over the smooth surface of the kitchen counter. The sound of a key turning in the lock interrupted her thoughts. The door opened gently, and Harper stepped inside, holding an envelope in her hand. She looked at Teresa, her expression unreadable, but there was something glowing beneath it. A spark of quiet pride. "Grandma," Harper said softly, handing over the envelope, her voice calm but holding an undercurrent of excitement. "It's here." Teresa took the letter, her fingers brushing against Harper's as she took it from her. The letter was official, crisp, Harper's college acceptance. Teresa could feel the weight of it, the culmination of years of hard work, of perseverance. A new chapter in Harper's life was beginning, one that would unfold on her own terms. Teresa held the letter for a long moment before opening it. The silence in the room was thick, full of years of struggle, of quiet victories. She unfolded the paper carefully, scanning the words. Acceptance. The words were small, but they held more weight than anything Eric had ever thrown her way. Harper's future was clear now. The road was open, her options limitless. Teresa smiled faintly, the joy of this small, private moment settling in her chest. No loud fanfare, no big celebrations, just this quiet moment of knowing that something had been built, that something would continue, long after the noise had faded. "Congratulations," Teresa said quietly, looking up at Harper. Her voice was full of quiet pride, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel for a long time. Harper's face lit up, her smile soft but full of meaning. "Thanks, Grandma," Harper said, her voice soft, a note of disbelief lingering. "It's really happening." Teresa nodded, placing the letter on the counter. She had worked hard for this. For Harper. For herself. For the peace she had earned. "It is," she said, her voice steady. They stood there for a moment, in the quiet of the condo. The weight of the past was finally behind them. Teresa felt the calm that had settled over her, a peace that was deeper than any noise of victory or public approval. It wasn't the house. It wasn't the money. It was the realization that, after everything, she could still find peace. Later, as the afternoon sun began to fade, Clara arrived at the condo, a packet in hand. She didn't need to say anything. The look on her face said it all. She handed the final certified trust packet to Teresa, the last piece of the puzzle. The final document. The one that closed the chapter for good. Teresa took the packet, her fingers tracing the edge of the envelope. This was the final step, the last measure of her control. She opened it slowly, reviewing the contents. Everything was in order. Eric's name was still nowhere to be found, the trust set in stone. Harper's future was secured, her inheritance protected. She looked up at Clara, her expression calm but full of quiet satisfaction. "You've done it, Teresa," Clara said softly. "You've secured everything. No one can take it from you now." Teresa didn't need to say anything. Her gaze moved to Harper, who was looking out the window, lost in her thoughts, the world outside stretching into infinity. Teresa exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of her choices settle into her chest. She had built this, piece by piece, quietly, with patience. The phone rang. It was Maya, but Teresa didn't answer. There was nothing more to say to her. Harper walked over to the table and took a seat next to her grandmother. The silence stretched between them, comfortable, steady. The moment felt infinite, one of those rare, unspoken times when everything was just right. Teresa poured 2 cups of tea. No toasts, no cameras. Just them. Just peace. The world outside continued to turn, but here, in this space, it was just them. And for the first time in years, it felt like everything was finally where it was meant to be. Teresa walked through the condo, the space now familiar under her feet. The walls, once bare, had begun to take shape, her small touches of comfort bringing warmth to the otherwise neutral space. There was something about walking through this new chapter alone that felt more right than she had imagined. The weight of her choices, the finality of them, had settled in her bones. But with that weight came a quiet strength, a knowing that everything had led her here. She moved through the rooms with steady steps, each one marked by moments of reflection, but also by relief. There was no longer the echo of Eric's voice in the halls, no longer the sense that she had to make room for anyone else's mistakes or expectations. It was hers. She stopped in front of the fireproof safe, the small but significant guardian of everything she had worked for. Her fingers lingered on the cool metal as she keyed in the combination, the sound of the lock disengaging filling the space with a soft click. The door creaked open slowly, revealing the contents inside: the deed to the condo, the updated will, and the trust. Each document a quiet victory, a reminder of the steps she had taken. Teresa carefully lifted each paper, feeling the weight of them as she laid them out on the table in front of her. Harper's name was clearly written in the trust now, every clause and decision etched with the intention of securing her future, no matter what. She picked up the deed for the house that no longer belonged to Eric, and let her fingers trace the words. Her gaze lingered on the documents for a long moment before she reached for the final piece. A letter. The last one she would write about this chapter. She hadn't included it before. It hadn't felt necessary, but now she understood its importance. She wrote it quickly, her pen moving in a steady rhythm, the words flowing naturally. To whom it may concern. I am writing to instruct that the contents of this trust, deed, and will not be updated without Harper Langley's present approval. Any changes made must be witnessed and signed by her, ensuring that her voice remains central in matters concerning my estate. This is to safeguard her future, and mine. I trust that this will be adhered to without exception. Thank you for your understanding. Teresa Langley. Teresa placed the letter inside an envelope, sealing it with a finality that matched the rest of her decisions. She felt no need to explain further. This was her piece, and Harper's. She had taken every measure to ensure no one could undo what she had built. Closing the safe with a soft click, she stood for a moment in the quiet. Her heart felt lighter, not from what she had let go, but from what she had held on to. The title she had taken back wasn't just about property or money, it was about self-respect. It was about reclaiming her life. Teresa turned and walked toward the door, stepping out onto the small balcony. The evening air had grown cooler, but she welcomed it. She needed to move, to leave the weight of the past behind her, step by step, without looking back. She walked downtown, the streets still busy with the evening crowd. It was strange how she now felt like a part of the city, but also, in a way, apart from it. People moved around her, but none of them noticed her. Unbothered, unnoticed. The world was unfolding, but it was no longer a place she had to fight to be heard in. She had made her decisions, and they were hers to own. As she passed Eric's law firm, she stopped for a moment, a faint smile crossing her lips. The building, dark now with the lights flickering in the windows, felt like something from another life. She could see the familiar silhouette of his office in the top floor, no longer a space she would ever step foot in. She didn't stop, though. She kept walking, her steps purposeful, each one taking her farther from the life she had once been forced to share with him. Harper's voice came to her through the air, soft but steady. "Do you miss him?" Teresa's pace never faltered. She didn't even need to look up at her granddaughter, whose words seemed to hold a quiet understanding in them. The question wasn't an accusation, just a quiet, reflective query. "No," Teresa said, her voice steady. "At his promotion party, my son called me embarrassing, so I quietly removed his name from the papers." The words hung in the air for a moment, but they didn't feel heavy. Instead, they were just the truth. Plain, simple, and final. Eric had made his mistake, and she had made hers too. But that was the past. The future was hers. And Harper's. They had nothing to prove to anyone anymore. The rest of the world could turn, could rush past her. But Teresa was at peace now. No more noise, no more manipulation, just silence, just control. And that, she realized, was the quietest victory of all.